Hello YouTube. Let's talk about this very interesting subject of telepathy. The phenomenon of telepathy or extrasensory perception has been known to mankind for millennia, but the first attempts at serious research of this phenomenon date only basically back to the second half of the 19th century. At that time, societies of psychic or parapsychological research began to arise in all scientific centers of Europe and the New World, studying a fairly wide range of extra or outside scientific phenomenon for spiritualism, from spiritualism to telekinesis. In Russia, in the Russian Empire, the first mediumistic commission was organized, headed by no less than the top scientist Mendeleev, and in 1881 the publication of the first Russian parapsychological journal Rebus began, and it was published until 1918, when the communists were in power and put an end to it. In 1882 in London, a group of scientists from the University of Cambridge founded the most famous such society, the Society for Psychical Research, headed by Professor Henry Sedgwick. The society has set as its main task to collect and verify many known cases of transmission of thoughts and feelings at a distance. At the beginning of the 20th century, a series of successful experiments on the telepathic transmission of visual images was conducted by the private associate of a professor at the Kiev University, whose last name was Zhuk, and before him, such experiments were conducted by the French physiologist, the future Nobel Prize winner, Professor Charles Richet, based on the large number of experiments conducted, and there were several thousands of them. Richet confirmed the existence of a telepathic connection between the inductor and the recipient. For the first time, he began to evaluate their reliability mathematically using the probability theory. In the first half of the 20th century, Dr. Rain's experiments on telepathy became widely known. He also began to use the Zener cards for subsequent mathematical processing. They were proposed to standardized experiments on telepathy and were the most common form. 5 cards with the image of a circle, square, cross, star, and wave. The inductor took them out at random from the file cabinet, or they were randomly thrown out by the corresponding mechanical device, and the recipient, being at a considerable distance, tried to guess the given pattern. From the point of view of mathematical statistics, the idea of using those cards was impeccable, but in the opinion of the Russian scientists, whom I mentioned in my other research on occasion, Valentin Psalomshikov, it was completely unacceptable and delayed the progress of research in this area for at least half a century. Judge for yourself. Suppose that the inductor is given the task to mentally suggest to the recipient any object or object that he should sketch, and a series of 5 experiments is conducted. In 2 of them, the images matched, and in 3 they did not. That is less than 50% matched, and the experiment is considered unsuccessful. In fact, the opposite is true. If 2 out of 5 drawings match, the effect of telepathy should be considered irrefutably proven. After all, a person is surrounded by millions, if not billions, of things and objects. But let's conditionally stop at 1 million. Suppose a butterfly and a gun were made up. The probability of a simple guess of one of them by the recipient will also be 1/1,000,000th, and guessing twice in a row is completely unrealistic. The situation with the Zener cards is completely different. There are only 5 of them, and the probability of guessing any of them is 1/5. Well, what's next to talk about? Moreover, these cards are equally known to both the inductor and the recipient, and this makes the experiment itself almost meaningless. If the inductor stares intently at one of them, this does not guarantee anything. The other four are still flashing in his head, and no one knows the mechanism that ensures their transmission, and therefore there is no guarantee that he telepathizes this particular card. This situation is similar with the recipient. As a result, Zener's cards revealed another phenomenon. The results of the next series, rather than the transmitted one, more often coincided, that is, the effect of prediction, anticipation of the result. And such an overlap of phenomena caused even less confidence in the results, even if they were mathematically processed correctly. This apparently was realized by the American researchers Targ and Puthoff, when in the 1970s they set up experiments on remote viewing. The inductor moved thousands of kilometers away from the recipient and at a predetermined time, for example at noon exactly, just looked at the surrounding landscape, probably with some kind of marker, Eiffel Tower, church, semaphore, etc., and the recipient tried to sketch this mentally accepted picture. And in such classically correct experiments, the effect of telepathy was confidently confirmed, since both participants could not accidentally guess the object of the transmission with the above probability, conditionally 1/millionth. Curiously, in these experiments, the effect of prediction was revealed when the recipient painted a landscape, for example, a barge on a river, which the inductor saw only in the next session. But we will not dwell on this phenomenon here. After the publication in the USSR in the 1960s of the books by Professor Vasiliev titled Mysterious Phenomena of the Human Psyche and Suggestion at a Distance, there, in that country, began a craze for telepathy, mainly at the amateur level, in many universities and research institutes of the country. I have to attest to it. I was very young at the time, but this was, I guess, my destiny to be interested in such subjects. And I remember one or two popular science books that discussed it. And I read one. I don't know if I understood everything at that age, but I remember it. The person that I often refer to, Psalomshikov, also was swept out in that craze, but he was older than me. At that time, in the 1970s, it was time to celebrate the centenary 100th anniversary of the first telepathic experiments. And it was also time to think who was still interested in this phenomenon at the time. So new ideas were needed, actually. In the early 1980s, one of these ideas was expressed by Psalomshikov together with the doctor of physico-mathematical sciences Stepanuk. It was known that a person uses the capabilities of his brain by only 3 to 4%. Most people, probably use less than that. At the same time, the efficiency of almost all biological processes in the body exceeds 90%. And then they pose the question in a completely different way. What are the other 97% of our brains doing? As a result, they came to the Jung's ideas. Only on the contrary, there is not a subconscious mind of every person and a collective unconscious, but a superconscious mind that unites the brains of 5 billion people into a single internet, or a collective superconscious that is into a single supermind for all mankind. Or if you want to, like a human anthill. What to call it is another question. To physically substantiate such a structure, neither mystical concepts such as the subtle world, nor fantastic particles like the microleptons, nor religious fabrications, as he put it, are required. But it is necessary to postulate the presence of a physical field of a nano-electromagnetic nature with a high penetrating power and preferably with a superluminal propagation velocity. Back then, in the late 1970s, such a field was purely hypothetical for them, but now the so-called torsion fields satisfying all these conditions can claim this role. Within the framework of their hypothesis, telepathy is just a signal propagating in the brain internet between its elements, subjects, over a single network, which means that it should not depend on a distance as in any similar telephone network, which is confirmed by experiments. Moreover, all people are initially telepathically connected to each other, but the call for communication comes to the superconscious, and only psychics can perceive it. So 3% of the brain serves the needs of a person himself, from ensuring balance when riding a bike to a love of beer and an interest in creatures of the opposite sex. In this regard, a normal, healthy person is completely autonomous and independent of the signals existing in his super or subconscious mind. Therefore, most of us are deaf to both telepathy and predictive signals that warn us of impending danger. The analog in religion is the guardian angel. Although some people, not being psychics, perceive these signals unconsciously, for example, in the form of an obsessive desire to leave a cozy trench a minute before a missile hits it or mine hits it, or to hand over a plane ticket that will get into the plane crash. But this is an inevitable price to pay for our complete autonomy from the superconsciousness, or what is the same thing, the freedom of the individual. The fate of contactees who spontaneously join the brain internet is very unenviable. However, any idea, not to mention a hypothesis, has the right to exist if practical conclusions follow from it. Since the author of the hypothesis I told you about, Psalomchikov and his colleagues, since they were discussing only the problems of telepathy, the main conclusion is simple. Telepathic signals are picked up not by consciousness, but by superconsciousness, and they must be somehow extracted from there. At the moment, there are two main methods for obtaining such signals: using an encephalograph directly from the brain, and the second, known for many millennia, and now scientifically called biolocation, dowsing. And here the tool is very simple. It is a willow twig now transformed into the L-shaped knitting needle and the so-called star pendulum. Any weight on a thread that is held in your hand. Once upon a time, by chance and unconsciously, a person began to use the effect of transformation from the superconsciousness into a tremor of the arm's muscles, the visual indicator of which is a rotating spoke or a pendulum swinging along a trajectory set by superconsciousness. When they realized this idea, they set up a simple experiment to transmit telepathic signals from one building of the Leningrad Hydrometeorological Institute to another over a distance of several kilometers. There was one inductor, two percipients. One was trying to perceive the information mentally, the other, the woman, was holding her own ring on a thread above the center of the circle with symbols printed on the circumference. The percipient who used the traditional method had zero result. The percipient who used the reception of signals from the superconscious or average, on average, guessed every second character. When they introduced some redundancy of signals into the information channel, a repeated repetition of the signal of the symbol, they managed to convey the simplest meaningful messages. Unfortunately, then, in the early 1980s, these results and their justification were not published. We're talking about the Soviet Union and official ideology and dogmas. And in 1984, in the collection Electromagnetic Fields in the Biosphere, published collection, the results of experiments on remote communication between biological objects, rabbits, were published, and they were conducted by V.P. Perov's group back in the late 1960s. And for obvious reasons, at that time not published in the open press. And by the way, the maximum distance in these experiments was 7 kilometers. During the experiment, the inductor rabbit was irritated with an electric current, and in the recipient rabbit, the corresponding signal was removed from the electrode planted in the brain. These experiments, with a sufficiently high level of reliability, show the presence of an information connected between spatially separated biological objects. Its authors also assume the existence of some kind of undiscovered biological field, but they do not completely deny the electromagnetic nature of the communication channel. Tell me how much more has been achieved in the past few decades from the open information, but I'm sure research goes on. So this is what I wanted to bring you again, because as you know, I bring you information about this Psyche research, which few people in the West know about, that took place behind the Iron Curtain and, in other places of the world. And if you like my research, please support me through the links you will find in the description to this video. Please tell others. Please like my video, subscribe to my channel, and I will bring you more on about this subject from time to time. So I want to thank you for your attention to my work.